And I will start sharing again. Okay, let me. All right, so today we are going to talk specifically about writing under pressure for quals. I know this is something that a lot of people get nervous about, and we're going to talk a little bit. I know there's different styles of exams. You may have more or less time, so maybe more or less pressure. But no matter how you're taking your exams, probably at some point you're going to have a limited amount of time to finish your questions, kind of get your ideas down. And it can feel like a lot of stress to try to take everything that you've prepped for quals and have to put it on the page in anywhere from 3 hours to 24 hours, depending on what you're doing. So we're going to look through today at just some strategies you can take in with you to make the process a little less stressful. So the first one is really just knowing what you're up against. I think a lot of us, I know this was the case for me going into quals, you're not really sure what's it going to be like, how is it going to be structured, how much time am I going to have, where am I going to be, and having a lot of question marks can make it a lot more stressful because it can add that element of uncertainty alongside just trying to get all of your ideas down in a brief period of time. So we're going to talk about just some ways you can get information that is going to really help you feel prepared for your exams. We're going to talk about some test taking strategies. So ways that you can, even if you don't know exactly what you'll face on the exam, that you can kind of quickly jump into drawing on some of these strategies to feel a little more organized in what you're doing. If you're nervous taking exams, this can kind of just help you to focus and get started. And then we're going to look at some ways to design practice exercises. I think the most important part of studying for quals and not feeling as much stress about writing under pressure is just practice. The more you can kind of set yourself mock exams or just do practice, the more comfortable you're going to be in the whole routine. So the less overwhelming it will be when you are actually sitting down and facing your exams. So I just want to throw this out there, and anyone can put an answer in the chat or just jump in. For those of you who are maybe, whether this is kind of far in the future or you're facing it down much sooner, what are some worries maybe you have about facing a timed exam or a timed take-home exam? Are there any kind of thoughts that you've already had about things that you feel unsure about or concerned about? And it's okay if you don't. Yeah, go ahead, Manar.
Yeah, for me personally, I like the taking home exam because I used to feel stressed in the exam room when we are in the school. Okay, and this is one of the my weaknesses that I have to work on it. Maybe the time to take the exam, we used to believe that the take-home exam might be harder than the school exam. So I worry too that the time will not be enough to do this task or to do this exam the right way to achieve the desired goal or the grade.
Yeah, I think that's a big concern we all have is just what if I run out of time? I know I felt that way, and it can be really stressful. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about some of the differences between the timed and take-home exams. But I think there's different kinds of stresses that go with each one. I see we have a couple things in the chat. Yeah, going into sufficient depth on a topic without spending too much time. This is a difficult one because sometimes you get into it and you realize I've spent half the time I have and I'm still writing about one source. You can get a little too enthusiastic about the first source you write about. So again, I think this is a good reason to do a lot of practice so you can balance how much you write about something, how much you need to say about a source to really get your ideas without, just focusing too much on one thing. Yeah, as an overthinking and worrying about it, I know that can be stressful because it kind of paralyzes you to even start writing on your exams. You spend so much time thinking about what you want to write and worrying that you're not doing it right. And again, we're going to look at some of the practices and strategies that can help you to kind of practice those elements so they're a little less overwhelming. Understanding the rubrics and strategy to answer each question. This is a good one to, spend a lot of time asking questions of your advisor or your committee so that you really do have a sense of what's expected of you. I know that just adds an extra layer of stress if you don't even exactly what you should be doing. Yeah, and Jocelyn, I'm actually going to mention this because this is something that I think comes up, is that for some people, the take-home exams, it's too much time. Having the pressure of just having to sit down and write quickly. That's how I did my quals. Mine were on campus. Mine were in history. I had to take them 3 days in a row on campus. So I had, my major field was 4 hours. Each of my minor fields were 3 hours. And I wrote probably 3 to 5 essays in that time. So you really don't have time to think. You have to just sit down, start writing, and get through it. Yeah, and Jocelyn, I think you have seen this workshop before, but hopefully it'll be a good refresher on that. So let's go ahead and dive into some of these issues. Let's see if it will let me. So the first one is, knowing what you're up against. And a couple of you brought up, uncertainty that could go around the exam. So having answers to your questions, before you're sitting there looking at your exam paper can be one really useful way to kind of mitigate the worry about the unknown and know how you can plan your most effective test taking practice. So the first thing is just get that information. I know with quals, we can often feel kind of left to our own devices. There's not a lot of scaffolding for this at CGU, but there are answers out there. So go to your department secretary, go to your advisor, go to a faculty member, and just start to ask questions. What does the exam typically look like? What should I expect? How might I be expected to answer the questions? This is kind of the general parts, there's more specific questions we'll talk about in just a second, but just kind of getting a feel for, how many questions might there be? How many answers am I expected to write in the given time? Just so you can start to kind of feel out what it all looks like. Every department is very different. That's why I'm not giving you a lot of specifics here, just because it does vary so much. But go to your department and find out, you have to form your committee before you do your exam. So just make sure that you know what the paperwork process is for that. Find out, I don't know, I know COVID kind of changed things. If any of you are now required to take on campus exams, or for many people, it's now an option, but find out, do I have to take it on campus? Can I take it home? How much time do I have? And the dates. This is something not to overlook, especially if you are doing them on campus. Just making sure you reserve that space can be a challenge depending on the time of year. So just make sure you do that kind of well in advance. As I mentioned, find out what the exact structure of your exam is. So, how much time do you have? Where is it going to be? Allowances. When I took my exams, I was allowed to bring a one-sided bibliographic paper that the secretary looked at to make sure I didn't have other notes. Scrap paper, a pencil, and like a bottle of water. That was all I could have. Mine was no notes. I couldn't have like a phone or headphones or anything like that. So just kind of know in advance what the conditions are going to be, so you can start to kind of think about that and prep for it. Start looking for resources. A lot of times your departments will have examples of past exams, or kind of different versions of what the exam might look like. So again, check with your department secretary. They have a lot of resources that can be really helpful for this. And then just find out about any necessary paperwork and what the ABD process looks like in your field. Some of this might be after your quals, but it's good to know kind of how the whole process works. So I just quickly want to go over 2 common exam formats. And I know this might not cover everyone's experience. I don't know what it looks like in every field. I'm more used to doing it in humanities and related fields. But in general, I think that we still have the on-campus exam, which, as I said, tends to be 3 to 4 hours, depending on your field on campus, usually consecutive days. And then your take-home exam, for which you usually have about 24 hours. These might be consecutive days. Some people space them out. Again, check with your department to see what you're allowed to do in that area. So I just put, this is kind of subjective. These are things just that I think, or from talking to students who have done both types, or some pros and cons to think about. I know some of you might not have a choice, but some of you do have an option of which one you want to take. So it's worth thinking about which one will work for you. So kind of as Jocelyn brought up earlier, on campus, you have fewer distractions. You kind of just have to sit down and write. I would be really distracted at home, even with those 24 hours. It's really easy to walk away from it, or to have kind of outside things happening that take you out of the moment. For me, also just having the pressure of not having very much time made me more productive, because when you have less than an hour to write each essay. You really just have to dive into working and writing. You don't really have time to worry about it or to get lost in your thoughts. You really just have to get it on the page. I think someone mentioned this earlier, that a lot of times there are fewer expectations when you're doing it on campus, just because your committee recognizes that you have less time. You're not using references, they're not expecting you to memorize quotes and make a lot of citations in your work that you might be expected to do if you have that 24 hours and you're at home with your sources. You also will likely write slightly shorter essays, again, just given the time constraint. So it's really important that you make them very focused. And again, this kind of think about yourself. How do you work? How do you write? Would this help you to kind of get things done without kind of getting lost in thought? Some cons, I think it's stressful. You have a limited amount of time. It can really heighten that sense of, what if I don't have enough time? What if my mind goes blank? There's all those little things that come in it. You're kind of watching the time click off the top. Sometimes just scheduling can be difficult. If you have a busy schedule outside of this, just finding the time can be a little harder than doing it at home where you have a space. You don't have a lot of time to revise. I had time to kind of quickly read through a couple of my answers. I ran out of time to do that for all of them, so revision didn't really happen. Another thing for me was, you don't get a copy of your answers. I don't know if this is true for everyone, but for me in history, I was allowed to go back to the secretary if I wanted to review my answers, but I couldn't actually take that with me. So it was something where I couldn't kind of use these answers to build on if you're working on maybe a dissertation proposal or something else that might incorporate what you did on quals. You just don't get to have that physical copy of what you did to take with you. So in contrast, the 24-hour take-home exam, the obvious pros, you have more time to work on it, more time to develop your ideas. It can be a little less stressful because looking at, 24 hours can be a little less scary than a few hours. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, not being able to take home the answers. I don't really know, Jocelyn, because I feel like, I wrote this and somebody else is not going to write the exact same, I'm not going to hand it to someone who's going to have the same questions and do the exact same essays. So I'm not exactly sure. And this was a while ago. It's possible they've changed that. I was never totally clear on why that was. It seemed to be something. So like you didn't share the answers, but since everyone's taking different exams, I would kind of understand if they were always the same questions or something like that. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure. And that might not be the case in every department. And they may have changed some of that now. That was just the case for me when I did my quals. Yeah, exactly. And I was going to bring this up, actually. That's a good point, Jocelyn, is prepping for oral exams. Since, you can go back and look at your answers again. So you could kind of go back a few days before your oral exam and look at it. But I would definitely recommend, if you do on campus, make notes as soon as you're finished with your exam. So if you didn't have time to write about something, that's a big part of what oral exams are for. So if you run out of time, you don't finish an answer, don't immediately think you're going to fail. The oral exams are a chance for you to elaborate on what you didn't get to do. Obviously, you want to get through as much as you can. If you only answer one question, that might be a problem. But the oral exams do let you come back and follow up. So yeah, if you don't get to take a copy of your answers home, make sure that you write down some notes about things you didn't write about. We all get out of quals and say, oh, I forgot that one source I really wanted to mention. And that's what the oral exams are for. So that's a good, and make a couple notes. What did you write about for each question? Do that when you're fresh right after the exam, so you can prep for the oral exam a little more efficiently. Just to kind of finish going through this, take home, you often have open notes. A lot of people kind of have a good idea of what the questions are going to be in advance. So you might have already written your essays. You might not even be writing them in that 24 hours. You might know that you're going to answer, 3 out of 5 questions. So maybe you write kind of partial essays for all of them, and then use that 24 hours to just kind of polish up your answers. And you end up with that usable final product. I know people who have taken their quals essays from a take-home exam and kind of inserted them into a dissertation or a dissertation proposal. So it's nice that you are not just kind of taking the exam and then losing that information. You can really write essays that you can then use in other aspects of your work. The cons, there are higher expectations because you have more time to work on it. You're expected to put a lot more detail. Like I mentioned, things like citations and quotes in your essays. And I kind of brought this up, just the possibility of distractions, getting lost in your ideas, maybe thinking too much, having too much time. So this is really just, if you have an option between the two, think about yourself, think about how you work. If you're a really anxious test taker, maybe the take home is better. If you like the pressure and you want to just get things done, the on-campus exam can be a good option. So get the answers to what your options are, and then just really think about what's going to be the best way to go for you. Just a couple of other things to get information. One of your best resources is just going to be your fellow students who have already taken exams in your field. So definitely, ask questions. What was their experience like? This could be someone outside of your field too. It doesn't have to be. We have a lot of overlap, but it can be really helpful if somebody in something really similar to what you're doing has already done this, because it's going to be the most relevant for what you're doing. And then finally, just for this one, the CWR, we can help you with this. So we have some online resources, but you can also make appointments with our writing consultants. If you just want to talk through exam strategies, if you want to kind of practice how you might go about it, and then keep attending these writing events. So we have a lot of weekend writing events that are just dedicated time. That can be a really good time to dedicate to like practice test taking. A lot of times we have like 1 hour work blocks. So you could just say, I'm going to pretend this is my exam. I need to write an essay answer to one of my potential questions and use that as a dedicated prep time. I kind of brought this up already, so I'm going to go through this a little more quickly, but definitely communicate with your committee. They may not reach out to you, but you can reach out to them, ask questions, know what the expectations are. Sometimes we can feel like we have to figure it all out ourselves, but don't feel isolated. Reach out to your professors, reach out to your advisor, find out, exactly what they expect can make you feel a little less nervous. Usually their expectations aren't as high as we all assume they are. So that can make you feel a little easier about going into it. They should be here to support you. That's their role on your committee. So never feel like you're asking too much of them and asking questions about this. And then just try to kind of get a sense of what do they think is most important to focus on. How should you go about kind of approaching them as the audience that you're writing for? And this might be different for your chair, for your other members. So just kind of get a sense. And one thing I just want to put out there with this is that I think sometimes we feel like our committees are going to try to trip us up with surprise questions or want us not to be prepared. I mean, sometimes you don't know what professors are thinking, but for the most part, your committee wants you to pass your exams. I think that's important to remember. They're not trying to, trick you into failing. They really want you to pass. And by the time that you are taking your exams, they have a pretty good idea of how you work as a student. They're going to know if, you put the time and effort in, or if this is something you maybe took too lightly. They're going to be able to, they're going to have a good sense of who you are already, but ultimately it looks good for them if you pass, it looks good for the school if you pass. They want you to be successful. So you have to put the work in, but don't feel like they're not here to support you or they're kind of working against you. They really want to help you get through this process. So if you want to go ahead and pull up that handout, or if you just have a piece of paper handy, maybe just start jotting down a couple of steps you can take right now to try to prep for your quals. So even if you're a ways off from that, can you start checking in with your department secretary to look at practice exams? Can you start asking your committee questions about what to expect? So we'll go through this one. We'll just take about 2 minutes. You can just jot this down on your form. So maybe something you can do this month, or, I know some of you are facing your exams much sooner, but if they are a little further off, to kind of take those steps.
I have a quick question. Katrina,
Yeah,
can I ask?
Yeah, Jessica,
Can
go
you
ahead.
just go back to the previous slide?
Sure. Was it this one?
Yeah, this
Okay.
one. So is this specifically after the calls? I mean, which is where I am right now in as my calls, and I'm getting my dissertation committee in place, a proposal is being made, and then of course, process of dissertation. So is this specifically for that, or
Well,
It
with
can
this,
be used more for that.
yeah, I mean, with this, I was talking about kind of before exams, because
Mhm.
we have to have a committee for exams as well. And sometimes there's not a lot of guidance on prepping for exams, but this is definitely the same steps you can take post exams.
Mhm.
If you're forming a new committee for your dissertation, or if you're adding new committee members, I would definitely do this again. And obviously you can always check in with these questions about your dissertation proposal as well. So, I mean, whoever's on your committee, whether it was for quals or your dissertation, should be there to support you and to answer your questions and to help you through the process. So I think this applies really no matter where you are in the whole process of getting through quals and the dissertation proposal.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah, sure.
Could you please go to the next slide so we can read the question? I was not
Oh
able
yeah,
to-
sorry,
Oh,
let me.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate it. No problem.
we'll just take maybe like 30 more seconds for this because I don't want to cut into our writing time this morning. And you can continue to work on this handout kind of throughout today. You can take it with you and revisit in the future. This is just kind of to start get you thinking about some concrete steps you can take to try to feel like you're getting answers and you're feeling a little more comfortable about what you need to be doing. We don't really have time to go around and share our answers, but please do just kind of jot those notes down for yourself and continue to develop this as you go along. So now we're going to jump into looking at just a few test taking strategies that can make the whole process a little less stressful, a little more efficient as you go along prepping for quals. So I'm going to kind of say we're talking here about time tests. This can be whether you're working on campus, in person, or on campus or at home. You probably will have some kind of timed test approach. So whatever that looks like, or even if you're just writing your essays in general, you can use some of these pieces of information for that. So I think it's important to know that even though you have a limited amount of time, you do still need to include things like a clear thesis, a clear structure, have cohesion among your paragraphs. Revised writing, if you're on campus, you might not have a ton of time for revision, but you want to make it look as polished and as much like a real essay as you can, given your time constraints. While your professors might give you some leeway, since it's not a ton of time, they do expect you to have a cohesive essay structure, not just to kind of write ideas on the page in kind of a free form way. You always want to be making some kind of a clear argument or thesis. I know this is going to vary by field what that looks like, but you don't want to just have an exam paper that's, this source said this, and then this source said this, and go through writing about your sources that way. You want to really set it up as a clear structure, clear argument, clear paper. We're going to talk a little bit about doing some pre-writing techniques. So you don't just sit down and immediately dive into writing. You can kind of take some time to plan out what you want to do. This might be 5 minutes if you have only a few hours to write all your exams. This might be longer if you have 24 hours to work. But no matter how much or little time you have, there's things you can do to just make sure the process goes more smoothly. And you really want to start making a plan of time management. How long does it take you to write these essays? And that's why practice is so important, because you just need to know, how much time do I need to write? Can I allow some time for revision? How can I feel less stressed that I'm just not going to have time? And by just knowing how long you work, that can help you to kind of manage how you go about writing the essays on your exams. So it's really important, I think, to take practice exams under exam conditions as much as you can. So many of you will have questions before the exam, whether you know exactly what they're going to be, or it's going to be, a few of these longer set of questions. You should kind of well in advance have some idea of what those questions are going to look like. And when I say under exam conditions, try to set things up how they will be when you take your exam. So if you can't bring notes with you, don't use any notes when you're practicing. If you're going to be on campus, you might not be able to practice on campus. You could try to find maybe a quiet space, but, don't use headphones if you're not going to be allowed to on the test. Don't, have time for breaks if you're not going to have that time on your exams. Try to kind of mimic those conditions as much as you can. And as you go through, really kind of keep a sheet and pay attention. How long does each task take me? Does it take me a long time just to kind of get ready to write and know what I want to write? Does it take me a long time to figure out what my argument's going to be? Does it take me the longest to, just write about each source or give a summary? What kind of is your, what things can you go through a little more quickly? What do you know you really have to focus down and allow that time for? The pre-writing and revision, we say 10 to 15% of the time. If you're on campus, it may or may not work out that way. You probably won't have that much time for every essay you write. And you kind of want to decide before you dig in, are you going to pre-write for all of the questions you want to answer right at the beginning and then work through them? Or are you going to take it question by question and just do one at a time? This is something to pay attention to in your practice exams. The risk with doing them all at once at the beginning is potentially taking way too much time to do that and then realizing you don't have time to write all your answers. The benefit is that then once you start writing, you can kind of just stay in that mode. You don't have to stop and reset thinking about pre-writing for each question. That's really going to be different for everyone. Just pay attention for yourself, what works for you, what you can do most efficiently. Your first step in your pre-writing, and I think somebody mentioned this, is just breaking down the prompts, highlight the keywords. What am I actually being asked to do? Because sometimes, it might ask you just analyze, it might ask you to compare, just be really clear on what you are actually being able to do, not just kind of what the general concept of the question is, but the specific steps that you're expected to take in answering your question. At that point, you might start creating a rough outline, jotting down what sources do I need to use, how might I put them together. And like I said, probably you will have this done before you actually sit down to your exam, because you should have a sense of what your questions are most of the time. So you should definitely make this part of your exam prep process, is making an outline for each question, writing out what those essays might look like. You want to have time to decide what is the thesis, what is going to kind of shape your answer. And I'm going to show you an example in just a second of a mind map, which can be a good kind of quick way to get your ideas together. And we already mentioned this, if you have time for revision, try to leave at least a couple minutes to just do a quick skim, make sure you didn't leave out something obvious, but you may not have time to go back and really polish up your answers. And especially if you're on campus, that's okay. No one expects them to be perfect. So I kind of mentioned this already, but read the prompt. You can, under stress, we can sometimes miss words, we can misread something. So just take your time, really go through, highlight the keywords, important topics. Some questions might have more than one step. It might ask you to like summarize and analyze, or summarize and compare. And these might seem like really simple things, but when you're in the moment and stressed, it can be really easy to overlook part of that. So just make sure take time with the question so you know what you're going to be asked to do. I kind of mentioned this: describe, analyze, compare, contrast. These are all going to be slightly different, or they might work together. So just really know what is the question actually asking you. So the idea with kind of practicing, and this is something we really do need to practice, and it's one of the key things to do when you're kind of simulating those exam conditions, is outlining or mapping. You need to have some plan for yourself of what you're going to write about. Somebody brought up the point of, what if I go into too much detail about one source? This can help you avoid doing that, because if you know, okay, these are the 5 things I need to write about here, you can kind of parse out your time, and I can't spend half an hour writing about one source. I need to spend 10 minutes on each one. But it can help you just see, here's what's coming, and stay on track with your exam. I know sometimes it can be like, oh, I just thought of another source I should write about, or maybe I should talk about this. And it can be really easy for things to just get muddled. So you want to be able to do your thinking quickly, but also clearly, and really stay on point. So you want to list out, what is the main point you're making, and then what are the supporting points. This will probably be, you know, what references, what sources do I need to refer to in those supporting points that I'm making. Just kind of have an idea, you know, be realistic about how much you can write in the amount of time that you have. Again, hopefully you have some sense of your questions going in, so you have an idea of what your thesis for each one might be. But if you don't, you need to kind of quickly come up with, how do I want to shape this? What do I want to argue? You want to decide ahead of time, how are you going to order your sources? So this can really depend on what your question is, what your field is. Am I going to talk about them, you know, as a background for this discipline, you know, sort of chronologically, like we might do in a historiography or something that's really giving the background of a field? Am I going to organize them by the type of argument the author is making? Am I going to, you know, write about one and then write about another one and then contrast them? Or am I going to do that as I go? These are just things to kind of have a sense. And again, doing the practice exams is so important so that this doesn't feel overwhelming and it's something you're comfortable doing kind of quickly for each essay. Again, always you want to keep your topic clear and cohesive. You want to make sure the paragraphs build on each other and all relate back to that main thesis that you did lay out. I want to just quickly show you an example of a mind map. If you Google this, you will find lots of these, but the general idea is basically an outline, but it can help to kind of have this visual sense. This can also be quicker to jot down. You know, if you're sitting there with a scratch paper in front of your exam screen, you can kind of just do this really fast without having to do it on the computer and like make it really fancy. It can just be scribbles. You know, write your main topic. What is my main point, my main idea kind of in the center of your page, so you keep coming back to that. And then surround it. Okay, this is a supporting idea. And then list, these are the sources that I need to write about for that supporting idea. And doing this, you know, even if you're on campus and you have a limited amount of time, spending 5 minutes doing this before you start writing is just really going to help you feel more organized, make sure that you're coming back to those sources you wanted to write about, kind of gets you in the mode of just thinking about the topic. If you have 24 hours, obviously you have more time to work on this and maybe make it more detailed. But no matter how much time you have, just kind of jotting this down so you can see it can really be helpful to refer back to. Oh, thank you, Joshua. Obsidian is a resource that Joshua mentioned. You can facilitate mind mapping with it. Yeah, great. Especially if you have more time to work with. If you're doing, you know, the 24-hour exam, you could work on this. I would also say, you know, start doing this for your questions ahead of time. So you have that, you can study from your mind maps and kind of have it in your head how you want to approach the questions. Thank you for that resource. Okay, so, you know, I kind of went over this in detail already. You still need to have a structured introduction. You want to have a thesis. Like I said, the important thing is not just to throw references to a bunch of sources. You need to make sure you're making a cohesive point. You probably are also going to have to clarify the significance. So why does this question matter in the field you're working in? Why are you approaching it this way? You know, you're not writing a 20-page paper on this, so it's going to be the really brief version, but you just want to show that you understand how the question fits into the bigger area that you're working in. You know, having that logical relationship between sections is essential. I've said this already, you know, the clear argument is more important. You don't want to just say, here's a bunch of facts I remember, here's a bunch of data, here's a bunch of quotes. You want to say, you know, here's the point that I'm making, and here's how I'm going to do it with the sources from our quals list. It's really more important to have a clear sense of what you're saying than just throw out a bunch of information. I mean, worst case scenario, if your timed exam, your mind just goes blank, write down whatever you can is okay, but that's kind of a last resort. When you're doing a revision, don't worry so much about, you know, typos or making sure your sentences are all well crafted. It's more important that your coherence and structure are clear. So, you know, 24-hour exam, you're probably going to be expected to polish it up a bit more. On campus, you're just not going to have time. So focus on those big kind of structural elements more than you know, don't get caught up in rewriting your sentences. You just won't have time to finish revising if you do that. And I really can't highlight enough how important the practice is, and really being attentive to how things go for you during your practice exams, what your struggles were, what your time management was, what you need to work on. It can be time consuming. I know this is something many of us, don't want to set the time aside for, don't have the time. As I mentioned, doing these writing events can be a good place to have dedicated work time. But this is really going to be helpful both to make you feel more confident going into your exams and to make sure that you're going to kind of perform the best you can when the pressure is on you, having done this kind of training beforehand. Learn how you respond to pressure. If you get overwhelmed, you need to just sit back for a minute. Can you maybe have a breathing exercise on hand to like refocus you, get you back into the moment, whatever kind of your struggles with anxiety around test taking or just needing to take that break, just kind of know what those things are and incorporate them. And, I know sometimes we can say, I just don't want to think about it. I don't want to deal with it, but taking the time to really manage the time, manage your exam as much as possible is going to make you feel less stressed and ultimately have a better outcome on your paper. So let's just pause here for a few minutes and you can pull up that worksheet again, or you can just kind of think about this. So just kind of thinking about yourself, how you work, how you face exams. What do you think your strengths and weaknesses are? Do you struggle coming up with that initial outline? Do you struggle coming up with a thesis? Is it just that you don't write quickly and you feel like you're not going to have enough time? And then what are your strengths? Maybe you write really fast when you know what you want to write. So taking more time to do those pre-writing skills might help you. Just sort of start to think about and what kind of works for you. And this is something you can build on as you do your practice exams. Really pay attention, what was easier, what did you maybe struggle with, and write those things down. So we'll just pause here for just a couple minutes to start jotting down some ideas on this. All right, so I think we're gonna keep moving on for now, but once you identify some of those strengths and weaknesses, part 2 of this is gonna be, what can you do in your practice to really amplify your strengths, improve your weaknesses? How can you kind of tailor this to what you really need to focus on? And I think I have this in the handout, but I really recommend revisit this. So if your quals are, in the spring, write down these things today, but then revisit this in a couple of months, see where you are. Have your strengths or weaknesses changed? Have you maybe found strategies? And then revisit this again, maybe a couple weeks before your exam, see where you are, see what your kind of last minute focus needs to be. This is kind of a dynamic process. How you feel about the exams, how you feel about approaching them is going to change, especially if your quals are, if you're prepping now for quals that are maybe next semester or next fall. Really kind of revisit how you're doing, check in with yourself along the way to see where you need to maybe refocus as you're prepping for addressing, especially any weaknesses that you feel like you might have in writing quickly for your quals. So lastly, we're just going to take a quick look at kind of designing some practice exercises for yourself. Remember that when you're doing this, you want to have specific goals when you're going through. So you don't want to just say, right now I'm going to work on prepping for quals, because that can be really broad. So you want to say, okay, I'm really struggling to write a clear thesis statement. So for the next hour, I'm going to take my question and just think about what my thesis might be. How might I put this together? Are there ways that I can do that more quickly and feel more comfortable doing it? So even if you only have half an hour a day to dedicate to prepping for your exams, it's going to be better than saying I'm going to sit down for 3 hours, but I'm not really going to focus in on a specific issue. It's really important to keep notes, keep a list for yourself. What's working for you, what's not working. It's a long process prepping for quals. You want to remember, you don't want to go backwards and kind of forgetting, did this work? Should I do that again? You also want to remember your victories and your milestones. So, if you were struggling to come up with an outline and you did practice and you feel more confident now, take note of that, write it down for yourself, say, look how far I've come with my prep, because this can be a long and daunting process, and remembering to stay confident and recognize your successes along the way is really important. The quals themselves are kind of the final point of this, but it's really about the value of the process and what you learn about yourself as a scholar along the way as well. As you get closer to the exam, maybe throw yourself a couple of curveballs, work on a question maybe you didn't have before, write a new version of a question just in case. It's not really about doing more prep work, just kind of give your, if you're kind of in a rut, if you're doing the same thing over and over, just kind of throw yourself something new so you can get your brain kind of working again. Keep a list. This is especially true if you're going to be working at home. Probably if you're doing on campus exam, you're not going to be expected to have direct quotes because they don't really expect us to memorize things like that. But if you're going to write at home, keep a list of quotes that you come to, and not just your notes, because those can be kind of longer and more overwhelming. But if you have specific things you want to cite, you can kind of have that list next to you. Or kind of memorize the points that you want to mention if you don't have that material in front of you. You want it to really be second nature what you want to highlight in each source. So it's not just, I know some of us might have 3 pages of notes about each source. You're not going to write all that. You're not going to remember all that. So you want to really look at each one. Okay, what is the thing that I really need to make sure I highlight from this source, and how can I do that quickly? The final thing, no matter how much you prep, no matter how prepared you are, there will probably be something you don't expect on your exams. I had a good idea of what my exam questions were going to be, and most of them were, but I did have one completely new question thrown at me on the exams. So the important thing is not to panic if that happens. You've done all this prep work, you know how to go about approaching it. Just kind of relax and say that, I can handle this. It's not going to be a question that's about material you haven't read or, completely outside the box of what you're doing. It might just be something you hadn't considered. But, don't panic, just kind of stay in it. You're going to feel more comfortable with all the practice you've done if that does happen for you on your exam. And I know that's a big fear for many of us. What if I get a question I didn't expect? What if I don't know how to answer it? I can tell you from experience, it's scary for a minute, but you will get through it and you will be okay. You know your stuff, you know your work, you have the answers, and you can get through doing that, even if it was something you weren't expecting. So this is just kind of ideas. Once you kind of look at those strengths and weaknesses, identify maybe where you want to improve or put more work into, design some specific tasks and exercises for yourself that really target those things. So for example, if you tend to write too much, you have a hard time just giving, a clear summary of something or getting to the point of what you want to write about, your task could be, I'm going to really focus down on how do I write a clear thesis statement? How do I quickly outline an argument? And you might do this by, pull a source out of your quals list that you've already read and made notes on, and just say, okay, I have 5 minutes to summarize this source. How can I do that? And just practice doing that for each one, because sometimes we have way too much information. It can be really hard to just get down what we need to. So just kind of say, okay, if I have to write about this book, what am I going to say about it? How am I going to do that quickly? Design brief exercises. So for example, if you have struggles with outlining, with making that mind map or whatever it is to kind of plan out your answers, set yourself a task. How can I quickly compare two of my sources? How can I do that in a way that makes sense? You don't have to overwhelm yourself by saying, I need to answer the full question right now. I need to compare all of my sources. Just practice by pulling out a couple. The kind of added benefit of this is you'll become even more familiar with your sources and more comfortable using them. So the more you can go over them, the better, and use them in kind of dynamic ways. Just reading your notes over and over again can sometimes not be the most helpful. You kind of get in that rote thing of just kind of memorizing what you said about each source, but really engaging with them and using them in different ways is going to help you, especially if you end up with a question you weren't expecting, or you have to kind of include things that maybe you weren't planning to in your final exam. Come up with a way to sort of evaluate on your doing with your exercises and what you're kind of concerned with. So if you're concerned, I'm just not going to have enough time, I feel like I'm going to run out of time, really time how long each task takes you and practice the ones that are taking too long. Kind of decide, okay, how long can I realistically spend on my mind map? How long can I really spend on each paragraph? If you're concerned that the quality of your essay isn't going to be good enough, practice reading out loud. This can be really helpful to just identify some of the weaknesses. Practice, give the question to somebody and then read your answer and see if they think it suits the argument that you're trying to make. You can also come to the Writing Center and do this. If you want to, you've been making some practice exams, you're not sure how they look, bring them, we can work through them. We can see, does it make sense to me as an outside reader? And we can help you with all of these kinds of tasks. So if you're really just struggling with making outlines, with writing quickly, with coming up with a thesis, bring your stuff to the Writing Center and we can help you find strategies to do that and become more confident with those aspects of your writing. So before I go into this, the last thing, and I think it's on the handout as well, is just kind of come up with a couple of specific tasks, specific types of practice exams you can do for yourself. And like I said, these are going to change along the way. This is a long process. So kind of keep track, really keep those notes on what you're doing, see where you're improving, see where you might still want to put that work in. And, ultimately, the fact that you're here shows that you are really putting attention into studying for quals. You're taking it seriously, focusing on it. So I'm sure all of you are going to be just fine. I'm sure all of your committees know how much time and attention you've given to this. The big thing with quals is just once you put the work in, try not to worry about it. For me, I know it was really stressful. The anticipation was probably one of the hardest parts in grad school, just prepping for quals. But when it was over, it was honestly one of those things where I was like, wow, I really didn't need to worry as much as I did about this. Like, I really kind of had this under control. It was tiring, but it wasn't scary. It wasn't that hard. It was something that once I had put all the work into, it was actually kind of nice to be able to get through it. The nice thing about quals is having that endpoint you're working to. Once we get into writing a dissertation, we don't always have those set goals where you can really say like, yes, I prepped for something, I accomplished it, I can do the next step. So try to enjoy the process as much as you can. For myself, I had to think about it, not just, oh, I have to get through this exam, but what can I learn along the way? This is your chance to take the time to read in your discipline. This is really what we want to do as scholars. We get to read, we get to engage with sources, we get to really understand where we're coming from. Your dissertation topic might develop out of these readings. This is really a time to enjoy, and I know that can be tough because of all the stress, but this is really a unique time where you really do just get to read in your field. So try to not just be focused on that endpoint of quals, but the whole process is really what is most important. And final thing, you know, for myself, I ended up pushing my quals date. I had planned to take them one fall. I ended up taking them in the spring. It really made no difference to my process. So I knew that I wasn't going to feel fully prepared to take them in the fall. I knew I could kind of push through and do it, but I was going to really be cramming and not getting as much out of the process. So I pushed them back a semester. I don't regret it at all. It definitely made it a better process. I got a lot more out of it. It helped me get started on ideas for my dissertation. So if you're kind of debating, am I going to be ready by a certain time? You know, it's worth sometimes realizing the value of the process and maybe pushing back the exam a little bit. You probably won't regret it in the future. So any questions? As I mentioned, you can always come to the Writing Center. Hopefully most of you have sorry, I'm blanking on the words, like profile set up with us to make appointments on our schedule. If you don't, come to cgu.edu/write to create your account so you can start making those appointments. One thing that can be helpful is to make kind of recurring appointments as you get closer to taking your quals. So you can kind of have those deadlines for yourself, maybe every 2 weeks. You know, this is what I want to get done in practice. This is what I want to get done in learning how to write a good thesis or mind mapping, and kind of stay on track with that. We are here to support you any way we can. I know quals can be scary and isolating, and we want to try to make that as undaunting as possible and to make sure you know you have support and resources to turn to. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm actually going to go ahead and stop the recording.